Welcome to True Crime Hidden Files. In today's episode, we take you back to a warm August night in 2022 when a birthday party in Detroit, Michigan, ended in tragedy. What began as an innocent celebration turned into a brutal double murder. By the end of the night, 2 friends were dead. Now, let's dive into the events of that fateful night. It was August 14, 2022, and 21-year-old Cristina Gaines had invited her closest friends to her family's home to celebrate her birthday. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, and the house in a quiet Detroit neighborhood seemed like the perfect spot for a small party. The group was familiar with one another, friends from school and work who had spent years hanging out. They arrived just after sunset, eager for a night of drinking and reminiscing about old times. The guests included Cristina's best friend, Kathy Rollins, her boyfriend Zachary Moore, and 3 other friends, Norman Holt, Ted Flynn, and Simon Thayer. They had all known each other for years, though some had drifted apart recently. It was a typical suburban gathering. Drinks were passed around, music played in the background, and the mood was light, at least in the beginning. As the night wore on, the group moved from the living room to the backyard, where the warm summer air made for a perfect evening. It wasn't until much later, closer to midnight, that someone suggested a game of truth or dare, a game they had played countless times before but which would take a dark turn that no one could have predicted. At first, the dares were harmless, the truths embarrassing but light-hearted. The group laughed as Cristina chugged a beer and Zachary shared a story from his teenage years. But as the game progressed, it became clear that the energy had shifted. Norman, always the one to push boundaries, suggested more intense dares, and the mood began to sour. The laughs became forced, and some of the group exchanged uncomfortable glances. When Norman dared Simon to retrieve a knife from the kitchen, the group hesitated. It was an odd dare, unnecessary, and made several people uneasy. But Simon, not wanting to back down in front of the group, followed through. He returned from the kitchen with a large kitchen knife, holding it awkwardly as he stood among his friends. The tension in the air was palpable, but the game continued. Then came the dare that would set everything in motion. Kathy was dared to hold the knife and prove she could handle a real dare. No one is sure who came up with the challenge, but it was clear that the game had taken a dangerous turn. Reluctantly, Kathy took the knife, her hands trembling slightly. There was something unsettling about the way Norman watched her, a look that didn't go unnoticed by the others. At 1:30 a.m., everything went wrong. What exactly happened next remains unclear, but what is known is that within minutes, the tension that had been building exploded into violence. The quiet backyard was suddenly filled with chaos. The knife, which had been nothing more than a prop for a dare, became the instrument of death. When the police arrived at the scene hours later, they found the bodies of Kathy Rollins and Simon Thayer. Both had been brutally stabbed. Kathy's body was found near the back door, while Simon was discovered in the living room. Blood trailed from the backyard into the house, leaving investigators with the chilling task of piecing together how the night had gone so horribly wrong. The party, which had begun as a celebration of friendship, had ended in horror. 2 young lives were lost, and the rest of the group, now left in shock, would have to answer difficult questions. How had a simple game of truth or dare escalated into a double murder? What had triggered the violent outburst, and who was responsible for the deaths of Kathy and Simon? The investigation that followed would reveal hidden tensions, personal grudges, and a series of events that spiraled out of control. But on that night, all anyone knew was that 2 people were dead, and the survivors had a story to tell, one that would change their lives forever. The crime scene at Cristina Gaines' house was one of quiet chaos. The Detroit Police Department responded to a 911 call just before 3 a.m. on August 15, 2022. What they found when they entered the house was chilling: 2 bodies, both with multiple stab wounds, and a group of visibly shaken young adults, some barely able to speak. Detective Claire Hastings was called to the scene. A seasoned investigator with over 20 years of experience in violent crimes, Hastings had seen her share of gruesome murders, but something about this case felt off from the start. The fact that both victims had been stabbed multiple times suggested a crime of passion, but the atmosphere of the house told her there was more to the story. As Hastings arrived at the house, she noted the disarray, the remnants of a party gone horribly wrong. Empty beer bottles and solo cups littered the living room, and the remnants of food were scattered across the kitchen counter. But it was the blood trail leading from the backyard into the living room that told the real story. Both victims had been found inside the house, yet the struggle seemed to have begun outside. The victims, identified as 20-year-old Kathy Rollins and 22-year-old Simon Thayer, were discovered with multiple stab wounds. Kathy had been found near the back door, while Simon lay on the living room floor. The blood smeared across the floors and walls suggested a frenzied attack, one that left little room for defense. Hastings knew immediately that this was no accident. Something had triggered a violent outburst, something deeply personal. Hastings started by questioning the remaining partygoers: Cristina Gaines, the birthday girl; Norman Holt, a childhood friend of the victims; Ted Flynn, another close friend; and Zachary Moore, Kathy's boyfriend. Each of them appeared to be in shock, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, and it was difficult to get coherent answers at first. Hastings knew that in cases like this, the first 24 hours were crucial, so she pressed forward, carefully gathering details while the crime scene was processed. The first to be interviewed was Cristina. She recounted the events of the night, how the group had been drinking, playing music, and having fun until someone suggested a game of truth or dare. What started as harmless fun soon took a darker turn.
Norman started pushing things,
Cristina explained.
The dares got weird. He was different. He wasn't acting like himself.
Norman had dared Simon to bring a knife from the kitchen. It was meant to be a joke, Cristina claimed, but the game shifted after that. The atmosphere grew tense, and the laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by nervous glances and awkward silences. According to Cristina, the group tried to keep the game going, but it was clear that something had changed. Norman, who had been drinking heavily throughout the night, seemed agitated, his behavior growing increasingly erratic. When Hastings questioned Norman later that evening, he was still visibly under the influence. Norman denied any intent to harm his friends. It was just a game, he kept repeating. But Hastings wasn't convinced. She noticed something in his demeanor, an edge of frustration, a flash of anger just beneath the surface. His behavior matched what Cristina had described. Hastings knew there was more to Norman's role in the night's events, but she also sensed that he was hiding something deeper. Back at the crime scene, forensic experts were working methodically. Dr. James Rowan, the lead forensic pathologist, began his preliminary assessment of the victims. Kathy's body bore 7 distinct stab wounds, most of them concentrated around her upper torso. The angle and depth of the wound suggested that the killer had been standing directly in front of her during the attack, possibly during a confrontation. Simon had been stabbed 5 times, with 2 particularly deep wounds in his chest that likely caused his death. The blood splatter patterns inside the house painted a vivid picture of the violence that had taken place. Kathy's blood had been smeared across the back door, indicating she may have tried to escape before succumbing to her injuries. Simon's body was found in the living room, but traces of his blood were found outside, suggesting that he had been attacked in the backyard and had staggered inside before collapsing. The kitchen knife, which had been recovered near Simon's body, was quickly identified as the murder weapon. It was a common household item, likely grabbed during the heat of the moment. But there was something odd about the way it had been handled. Despite the chaotic nature of the crime, the knife bore no fingerprints. This indicated that the killer had either wiped it clean or, more disturbingly, had been wearing gloves. It was a small but significant detail, one that pointed to premeditation or, at the very least, an awareness of how to cover up evidence. One of the first things Hastings noticed when she entered the house was the distinct smell of marijuana mixed with the acrid scent of alcohol. But as the toxicology reports began to come in, it became clear that marijuana wasn't the only drug in the mix. Blood tests revealed that Norman had traces of an amphetamine-based stimulant in his system, a drug known to heighten aggression and impaired judgment when mixed with alcohol. This discovery added a new layer to the investigation. Norman's erratic behavior during the game of truth or dare could now be partially explained by the drugs in his system. But Hastings wasn't convinced that drugs alone were the trigger. The violence seemed too specific, too directed. There had to be another factor, a personal motive that had been simmering beneath the surface for months, maybe even years. As Hastings dug deeper into Norman's background, she uncovered a history of tension between him and the victims. Though Norman had been friends with both Kathy and Simon for years, there were signs that their relationships had soured in recent months. Several mutual acquaintances mentioned that Norman had been acting strange lately, withdrawn, irritable, and prone to sudden outbursts of anger. A particularly telling piece of information came from a former classmate who revealed that Norman had once dated Kathy in high school. Their relationship had ended badly, with Norman accusing Kathy of cheating on him with another student. Though years had passed since their breakup, the animosity between them had never fully disappeared. Kathy had moved on, but Norman clearly hadn't. Simon's role in the dynamic was less clear at first, but a few of the group's friends hinted that Simon and Kathy had grown close in recent months, possibly reigniting Norman's jealousy. The discovery of this old grudge added significant weight to the investigation. Norman's drug use may have pushed him over the edge, but it was his unresolved anger and jealousy toward Kathy and Simon that had fueled the violence. With this new information in hand, Hastings brought Norman in for a second round of questioning. This time, she was armed with the toxicology reports and the evidence of his past relationship with Kathy. Norman's demeanor had changed since the night of the murders. He was sober now, but there was a nervous energy about him, as though he knew the walls were closing in. When confronted with the evidence, Norman initially denied everything. "It was just a game," he repeated, his voice shaking. But as Hastings pressed him on his history with Kathy, his defenses began to crack. He admitted that there had been lingering tension between them, but he still insisted that the murders were not premeditated.
"I didn't mean for it to happen,"
he said, tears welling up in his eyes.
"It was the drugs. I wasn't thinking straight."
Hastings wasn't ready to buy his story just yet. The evidence suggested that the murders were more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. The fact that the knife had been wiped clean or handled with gloves indicated a level of premeditation, and Norman's deep-seated grudge against Kathy and Simon provided a clear motive. But there was one more piece of the puzzle that Hastings needed to confirm: the timeline of the murders. The forensic team continued to analyze the evidence, piecing together the timeline of the murders. Based on the blood patterns and the positions of the bodies, it appeared that Kathy had been attacked first, likely near the back door as she tried to flee. Simon, hearing her screams, had rushed to help, but by the time he reached her, it was too late. He was then attacked in the backyard, managing to stagger inside before collapsing in the living room. The toxicology reports showed that Simon had also consumed alcohol, but there were no drugs in his system. This suggested that Simon had been relatively sober when the attack occurred, which made his inability to defend himself all the more puzzling. Hastings began to suspect that Simon may have been taken by surprise, perhaps by someone he trusted. As the forensic analysis continued, another key piece of evidence emerged: a series of text messages exchanged between Norman, Kathy, and Simon in the weeks leading up to the murders. The messages revealed a growing tension between the three of them, with Norman repeatedly reaching out to Kathy in an attempt to rekindle their old relationship. Kathy's responses were polite but distant, and it was clear that she had no interest in reconnecting with him. In the days leading up to the party, Norman's messages became more erratic. He accused Kathy of leading him on and made veiled threats about getting what he deserved. These messages, full of frustration and anger, painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control. Kathy, on the other hand, seemed to brush off his increasingly aggressive behavior, perhaps not realizing the depth of his resentment. What was clear now, to Detective Hastings, was that Norman's long-held grudge, fueled by drug use and alcohol, had set the stage for the tragic events of that night. The messages also revealed a chilling detail: Simon had been caught in the middle of Norman's obsession with Kathy. In several texts to mutual friends, Simon expressed concern about Norman's behavior. He had even considered confronting Norman privately, warning Kathy that Norman's fixation on her was becoming unhealthy. Simon, though well-meaning, had unknowingly become a target in Norman's growing rage. His closeness to Kathy, combined with his protective nature, likely intensified Norman's feelings of jealousy and betrayal. By now, Hastings had a clearer picture of the sequence of events, though she still lacked a full confession from Norman. From witness statements and forensic evidence, it was likely that the game of truth or dare had acted as a catalyst, forcing tensions to the surface. Norman, under the influence of drugs, had likely initiated the dare with the knife as a way to assert control over the situation. But as the night progressed, the combined effects of drugs, alcohol, and his unresolved anger pushed him past the point of no return. As the investigation progressed, more witnesses were brought in to fill in the gaps. Cristina Gaines, though still shaken, provided additional details about Norman's behavior earlier in the night.
He was on edge the whole time,
she told Hastings.
At first, I thought it was just the alcohol, but there was something else. He wouldn't stop staring at Kathy.
Christina's statement further confirmed what Hastings suspected. Norman's fixation on Kathy had been brewing for months, and the events of that night had simply unleashed what had been simmering beneath the surface. Forensic analysis of the kitchen knife, the murder weapon, continued to raise questions. Though Norman had claimed the murders were unintentional, the wiped fingerprints and the precise handling of the weapon suggested a level of awareness. Hastings began to suspect that, at some point during the night, Norman had made a conscious decision to use the knife not just as part of the game but as a means to settle his old grudge. Norman's choice to introduce the knife into the game now seemed symbolic, an assertion of control over Kathy and Simon, the two people he felt had wronged him. The more Hastings considered it, the clearer it became. The game had been a smokescreen, a way for Norman to confront his past grievances without directly admitting his motives. But when the moment of truth came, the drugs and alcohol took over, and the violence that followed was far more brutal than he had anticipated. With Norman's role in the murders becoming more evident, Hastings knew she was close to uncovering the full truth. The toxicology reports, text messages, and witness statements all pointed to a premeditated attack fueled by jealousy and substance abuse. But Hastings was careful not to push too hard too soon. She wanted a full confession, one that would bring closure to the case and ensure that justice was served for Kathy and Simon. Norman's mental state continued to deteriorate during questioning. He oscillated between denial and guilt, claiming at one moment that the drugs had made him do it, and at another that he didn't remember what had happened. But Hastings had enough evidence to proceed with charges. The pieces were falling into place, though there were still questions left unanswered, questions that would be addressed in the final stages of the investigation. Detective Claire Hastings knew she was close to the truth, but one crucial piece was still missing: Norman's full confession. Over the course of the investigation, the evidence had painted a clear picture. Norman Holt, under the influence of drugs, had acted out of jealousy and unresolved anger. But there was something about the way the murders had unfolded that didn't sit right with Hastings. It felt too personal, too targeted. And there was still the matter of how premeditated the crime had been. Hastings decided to confront Norman one last time, armed with the toxicology reports, the messages, and the forensic evidence. Norman sat across from her, visibly tired and agitated. The drugs had long since left his system, but the weight of what he had done was starting to sink in. His hands trembled as he rubbed his face, avoiding eye contact with the detective.
Norman, we need to talk about what really happened that night,
Hastings said calmly.
We know you were under the influence of drugs, and we know about your history with Kathy. But this wasn't just a drunken mistake, was it? There's more to it, and I think you know that.
Norman's eyes flickered with fear, his lips quivering.
It wasn't supposed to happen like that.
What wasn't supposed to happen?
I wanted them to know. I wanted them to feel what I felt.
Feel what, Norman?
She left me. Kathy left me for him. For Simon. I could see it in their eyes that night. They thought I was nothing. But I wasn't nothing. I was the one who had been there for her all those years.
Suddenly, the full weight of Norman's grudge came crashing down on Hastings. This wasn't just about jealousy, it was about revenge. Norman had harbored resentment toward Kathy for years, but the game of truth or dare had given him the perfect opportunity to confront both Kathy and Simon in a twisted, symbolic way.
That night, when we started playing the game, I didn't plan anything. But when I dared Simon to get the knife, something clicked. I saw them together, laughing at me, and I couldn't take it anymore.
Hastings stayed silent, allowing Norman to continue.
When Kathy took the knife, I could feel everything bubbling up. All the anger, all the things I never said. And when the moment came, when the game was at its peak, I didn't think. I just acted.
Norman's confession was raw, unfiltered, and chilling. The game had been more than just a game for him, it was a way to force Kathy and Simon to confront their past, to make them feel the pain and betrayal he had carried for years. But under the influence of drugs and alcohol, that plan had spiraled into a violent outburst, leaving 2 people dead.
He wiped the knife clean. Why?
I don't know. I panicked. I thought maybe if I cleaned it, I could undo everything. But it was too late.
The timeline of events became clearer with each passing minute. Norman had attacked Kathy first, near the back door, stabbing her multiple times in a fit of rage. Simon had tried to intervene, but Norman, driven by jealousy and drug-fueled paranoia, turned the knife on him as well. Simon's attempt to flee had ended in the living room, where he collapsed and bled out. With Norman's confession in hand, the case moved quickly to trial. The prosecution presented the text messages, the forensic evidence, and Norman's own admission of guilt. The defense argued that Norman had been under the influence of drugs and alcohol, impairing his judgment, but the premeditated nature of the murders was impossible to ignore. The knife, the wiped fingerprints, and the veiled threats Norman had made to Kathy in the days leading up to the murders all pointed to a crime driven by jealousy and rage, not a simple moment of intoxicated violence. The courtroom was packed with family members and friends of the victims, all seeking justice for Kathy and Simon. Norman sat motionless throughout the proceedings, his once vibrant personality replaced by a hollow, broken man. He knew what he had done, and there was no escaping it. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. Norman Holt was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge, in her sentencing, acknowledged Norman's history of mental health struggles and substance abuse but made it clear that his actions were deliberate and calculated. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As Norman was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Detective Claire Hastings watched from the back, reflecting on the case that had consumed her for months. The murders had been senseless, driven by a combination of jealousy, drug use, and long-held grudges. It was a stark reminder of how quickly emotions could spiral out of control, especially when fueled by substances that impaired judgment. In the weeks following the trial, the community in Detroit tried to make sense of the tragedy. Kathy Rollins and Simon Thayer were remembered by their families and friends as vibrant young people with bright futures ahead of them, futures that had been cruelly cut short by a senseless act of violence. Cristina Gaines, who had been the host of the ill-fated party, struggled with the weight of guilt, knowing that a night meant for celebration had ended in such horror. Ted Flynn and Zachary Moore, the other survivors of the night, moved on with their lives, but the memories of what had happened would haunt them forever. For Detective Hastings, the case was closed, but the questions it raised lingered. How had things gotten so out of hand? Could the murders have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? And most disturbingly, how many more people out there, just like Norman, were harboring their own secret grudges, waiting for a moment of weakness to act? As we bring this tragic story to a close, it's a chilling reminder of how fragile our relationships can be and how quickly they can turn deadly. Thank you for joining us on this episode of True Crime Hidden Files. If you found this case as fascinating as we did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit the notification bell for more gripping true crime stories. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case, and we'll see you in the next episode.